So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation titled After Minneapolis, a Teach-In on the George Floyd Uprising. My name is Gina Perez, and I am professor and interim chair of the Department of Comparative American Studies here at Oberlin. And it's truly an honor to be here and to be your discussant this afternoon for what I know will be a thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion with 6 of our distinguished faculty. The grim reality of the recent police killing of George Floyd is sadly what brings us here together today. And our goals with this teach-in are to provide a space for faculty to share their perspectives and insights about the recent events, as well as other important information and context for understanding the history of white supremacy in the United States, as well as the ongoing demands for justice that are taking place across the country today. All of our panelists' comments today will demonstrate that systems of racial and social control are not new to this country. And while recent protests and organizing and responses reflect the incredible rage and frustration and anger that many of us feel, this moment is also an invitation to recognize what my colleague, Professor Meredith Gadsby, reminded me of this morning, which is Audre Lorde's important insights about the restorative power of anger. It is this restorative power of anger that I would argue informs not only the work that we do and that we come together with you to share with all of you today, but it also informs the sentiment shared by civil rights attorney and legal scholar Michelle Alexander, who recently observed on her reflections of the past 2 weeks that, quote, "Our only hope for our collective liberation is a politics of deep solidarity rooted in love," unquote. So it is this restorative, righteous anger, as well as hope, that guide our conversations today. Each of the 6 presenters will have approximately 5 minutes to share their thoughts. And while they're speaking and immediately following their presentations, you will each have a chance to submit questions or comments using the Q&A function in Zoom, where we will gather the questions and pose them to the speakers for the final 25 minutes of the teach-in. I will begin by introducing each of the speakers in the order of their appearance. So we'll begin with Professor Matthew Rary, who is an assistant professor of art history. He teaches and researches African and Black Atlantic visual culture and representations of enslavement from the 17th century through the present. Professor Charles Peterson is associate professor of Africana studies. His research and teaching interests include Africana philosophy, film, and Africana political and cultural theory. Professor Renee Romano is the Robert S. Danforth Professor of History and Professor of Comparative American Studies and Africana Studies. She writes and teaches about white supremacy, racial violence, and the legacies of longstanding historical injustice. Professor David Forrest is assistant professor in the politics department. He studies social movements and the politics of inequality in the United States. Professor Jennifer Garcia is an assistant professor of politics and comparative American studies. Her research and teaching focus on American political institutions and race and ethnic politics. And Professor Justin Emeka is associate professor of Africana studies and theater, and he is a director, writer, and actor and capoeirista who teaches courses in directing and writing here at Oberlin. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we will begin with Professor Rary, who will have about 5 minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for the gift of your attention. Thank you for your time. And thank you for allowing me to share a bit of the historical context, the initial thoughts that I had when I first saw not just the protests in Minneapolis in the wake of George Floyd's murder, but the images that resulted from those protests. In a photograph taken on the night of May 27th, a shirtless participant in the uprising, depicted here, playfully poses, his fists raised and his biceps flexed, in front of a burning auto zone in Minneapolis. Two others wield cell phones so they can capture his backlit figure. In the ensuing days, this image and others making use of the stark contrast of dark night skies, black skin, and burning buildings proliferated in social and mainstream media, where they served to document the smoldering awesomeness of Black rage. But in a speech delivered 3 days after this photo was taken, activist Tamika Mallory castigated white Americans for their perception of the protests as either unprecedented or unrestrained. America has looted Black people, she said. America looted the Native Americans when they first came here. Looting is what you do. We learned it from you. We learned violence from you. And if you want us to do better, then damn it, you do better. Considering my next few minutes as an art historical footnote on Mallory's point, one that builds on the work of Bell Hooks, Christina Sharp, Simone Brown, Krista Thompson, and other Black visual theorists who tell us that the work of dismantling white supremacy can't be disentangled from the work of interrogating the proliferation of media meant to serve it. Media that was often carefully constructed to scaffold and to naturalize the white supremacist and capitalist heteropatriarchy on which we all stand. This 1921 photograph, for example, depicts billowing smoke rising from the fires of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at the time the wealthiest Black neighborhood in the United States. On June 1st of that year, the city's white residents invaded and set fire to the district, killing between 100 and 300 Black Americans and injuring thousands more, causing $32 million in property damage and leaving 10,000 people without housing. Most survivors left Tulsa, and the event was carefully erased from official histories. But the existence of this photograph, which was for nearly a century stored in a personal family photo album, demonstrates how the personal documentation and recording of white supremacist violence remains a critical arm of its power. Indeed, images have long been crucial to the project of erasing explicit anti-Black violence. This painting from 1655 depicts at lower right a group of enslaved Africans in northeastern Brazil as they merrily display the fruits of their labor. Framed against a verdant pastoral background, the artist's emphasis on the Africans' docility makes it seem as if their labor is natural, aesthetic, and even beautiful. But the strategy of this image, of a type so common as to be ubiquitous during the era of the slave trade, is actually to obscure the unending violence committed by white slave owners against the enslaved, while also erasing indigenous Brazilians' claim to the land or its care. So I submit then that this image is actually an image of explicit anti-Black violence precisely because it does not appear to be as such. But we can easily scratch this surface a bit. For we know that Black people in this hemisphere have long strategically protested forms of violent erasure through their artistry. Between 1957 and 1972, a section of Interstate 10 was constructed above Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans, which was then the oldest Black main street in the country. Despite residents' objections, the government bulldozed 500 homes and closed many businesses, essentially destroying the community's lifeblood to create the interstate. A major economic slump followed in the area, which in turn led to increased violent policing of Black residents who had stayed, but few work prospects or social services to support them. And it's no coincidence that, for decades since the highway's construction, the city's Black Mardi Gras Indians march up and down this section of Claiborne Avenue on St. Joseph's Night each March, as their shouts and drums echo between the ground and the highway. This sequined, feathered, and even vibrant form of protest and reclamation was particularly strong in 2018, when the Big Queen and the Big Chief of the Creole Osceola tribe, pictured here, presented striking beaded images of bald eagles and other US national symbols on their suits, while at the same time defiantly walking up and down the avenue, stopping traffic as they did. Over the coming months, experience tells us that white supremacist ideologies will find a way to weaponize the stark and fiery images of so-termed property destruction that resulted from the protests. Indeed, they always have. This engraving from 1796 depicts the early stages of the African revolt against the white planter regime in what is now Haiti. The cacophony of bodies and plumes of smoke served, again, to confirm upper-class French viewers' perception of Blackness as inherently unrestrained and violent in the absence of white surveillance. But the engraver is lying to himself. Because look at those hills that are in the background that look far less like the Haitian landscape than like piles of refined sugar, themselves the products of violently enforced labor of enslaved people. Indeed, in an op-ed last week, the California-based activist L.S. Pierce may have said it the best. So when I hear people complain about the riots, or rather the revolt, what I really hear people are saying, but why would you burn down your own plantation? Tamika Mallory had to shout her point about white violence because it so often manifests as banal and quotidian. And so, returning to the image with which I started, we must be ready to call out and name the centuries of narratives carefully constructed by those in power, which urge you to interpret images like this as depictions of apolitical, generic, and baseless Black anger. But resist that urge, because you know that actions by Black protesters and Black artists are often, if not always, occurring in the context of deep histories of settler colonial violence and are directed at specific charged locations and memories. So pause to look carefully and to listen intently and to continue to fight against the invisibility of violence on which we all live so we can envision and make the world anew.
Thank you, Professor Rary.
Thank you.
So now we'll turn to Professor Charles Peterson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm proud and pleased to be here. I want to pick up in a certain way on Professor Rary's point about sort of the question of, in quotes, violence. And I want to think about the ways in which the events of the past week and a half have been framed by the media. Certainly the question of violence or what's happening in the streets or the destruction of property. And I also want to think about it briefly in terms of what I'm thinking about as a misuse of Martin Luther King Jr., right? There's always this sort of media desire to show some image of a building burning and then sort of quote King as if King would sort of from his resting place look down in shame and disappointment on contemporary Black activists. And certainly King was not an advocate of what we would call violence, but he certainly was an advocate of direct action or civil disobedience, right? The media would have us to believe that King did not believe in some sort of social disruption, and that's not the case. So in that sense, I think the activists today are in line with him. But I want to speak and think about how this thing that we call sort of violence or militant sort of Black action is a very real and a very long and enduring part of the struggle of African descended peoples within the United States. And much of it is grounded in an understanding of the implacability of white supremacy and the implacability of those institutions and the failure of those institutions, say, post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, that were unwilling to deliver upon the promises of freedom. Much of it's theorized, right? From where we can look at sort of the earliest rebellions in the 17th century. We can think about the rebellions in the 18th century. We can think about certainly, I believe, arguably the first theorist of militant action, David Walker, right, and his writings in 1827. We also have, and someone I'm studying now, Ida B. Wells, right, who advocated for self-defense in the face of lynching. We certainly have to take very seriously within the civil rights movement, not just the Black Panther Party, which most people know about, but we also have to think about the Deacons for Justice, a militant sort of self-defense group in Louisiana, and I think most notably and unheralded, Robert Williams of Monroe, North Carolina, who was a member of the NAACP, who sort of armed and organized his followers. So that's an important point, but what we have to realize is that these instances are assertions of an idea about Black humanity, right, which is going unrecognized by white supremacist violence. So David Walker argues Black humanity in light of a Christian-based belief, right? Africans are the children of God and are inherently should be granted certain respect. Ida B. Wells is attempting to reclaim and literally fight for the rights guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X, in his articulations for Black self-defense stood upon the ground of the fundamental human rights that Black people have, right? And these are human rights as understood, established in the post-World War II period with the rise of the United Nations and its various doctrines. So it's important to understand that in most cases, certain types of civil disobedience have been aligned with or worked or been interwoven with, complementary to militant action, or what we call sort of armed aspects or militant struggle. So I think this is important in terms of understanding how the media will frame this, how you hear sort of certain political sort of thinkers or politicians frame this. And I think it's important going forward to understand that this is a tool in the traditional toolbox of Black activists, right? That this is something that I would not be surprised if it moved in certain types of, in certain conditions, that this is a possibility, but understand that this is a part of a tradition. Right, and these have been very disciplined, very specific actions that can take place. But I encourage you not to fall into the idea that these are people wilding in the streets, or this is a sign of a lack of control, or this is some sort of action that is in complete contradiction to the ways in which African peoples in the United States have been fighting for their freedom over the past 400 years.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Peterson. We'll now turn to Professor Renee Romano.
Thank you. And I want to thank Professor Perez for moderating, my fellow panelists, all of you for tuning in. On the one hand, the events of these past 2 weeks have felt to me distressingly familiar. Another chapter of the nation's very long history of white supremacy and racial violence. But on the other, the protests and demonstrations around the country, the incredible leadership and work by young people of color in demanding systemic change, the impact these demands are already having, is feeling to me somewhat new and different. So in my brief comments, I want to try to put both of those in historical context, both the familiar and what seems to me might be something new, a real departure from historical patterns. George Floyd's murder is further reminder that this country has never grappled with or effectively addressed the centrality of racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness in its history. We have never effectively undermined or fully displaced the ideologies of racial difference, the stereotypes of Black criminality that developed as a result of the history of slavery. The work of historians like Barbara Fields and activists like Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative demonstrate that whites developed a belief in Black inferiority as a way to explain to themselves why it was okay to own slaves in a country that claimed to be based on ideals of human equality and democracy. Those ideologies were not discredited or effectively challenged after the Civil War. They still shape our political systems, our institutions, attitudes of both implicit and explicit bias. We have never offered meaningful reparations or economic compensation for slavery or Jim Crow, and instead, over and over again, we have seen policies and practices that protect, uphold, and augment the privileged economic position of whites. Welfare policies, education policies, housing policies that have repeatedly and consistently served to create and increase the wealth gap between Blacks and whites in this country. And we have never effectively challenged the long history of racial terrorism condoned by and practiced by the US state. When I see the video of Derek Chauvin looking straight into the camera while in the act of murdering Floyd, I think of lynching photographs, where we see crowds of whites standing looking into a camera with a Black body hanging in the background. They could look straight into a camera because they had no fear they would be held legally accountable for their actions, because they knew that in the United States, there was widespread acceptance of racial violence to construct, maintain, and uphold white supremacy, whether in the form of unofficial violence that the state allows or official violence practiced by representatives of the state like the police. Yet this history has long been ignored, denied, and obscured by white people in the United States. And historically, this denial, this unwillingness of white Americans to acknowledge and recognize the depth and extent of systemic racism and racial violence has been one of the key ways in which white supremacy has been upheld and maintained. We see this denial whenever people excuse police violence as the work of a few bad cops. We see this denial when Black victims of racial terror are blamed for bringing it on themselves. We see this denial when our president and vice president say there's no such thing as systemic racism, and it's time to stop talking about it so the nation can heal. In the 1960s and 70s, as African Americans were marching in the streets, the brilliant author and social observer James Baldwin despaired of what he described as white innocence, or whites' unwillingness to recognize the reality of racism and of the Black experience in America. In his 1963 masterpiece, The Fire Next Time, Baldwin defined it as a crime that, as he wrote, white people, quote, have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. It is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. And if anything, we've seen this crime of willful ignorance, the unwillingness to recognize racism, get worse in the years since the Civil Rights Movement. In the wake of that movement, many in the nation embraced a civic mythology of racial progress, a mythology that holds that the passage of civil rights laws successfully rooted racism out of public and institutional life, and then insists that any racism today is due to individual acts of bias, not the workings of institutions or systems. So when I look at what is happening in the country today, yes, I see the same patterns of violence, but I see something new too. I see a disruption of the ways in which a majority of people in this country have been able to remain ignorant, to deny the reality of systemic racism, to deny how policing has been a tool of white control over Black bodies for centuries. In the past few weeks, there have been protests in nearly every American state, in cities, small towns, suburbs, and rural areas. There has been a striking shift in attitudes. The number of Americans who say racism and discrimination is a big problem in the United States is up 26 points since 2015. The Washington Post today reported that over 2/3 of Americans believe George Floyd's killing reflects broader problems in policing. In contrast, after the killing of Michael Brown in 2014, 2/3 of whites insisted that his killing had nothing to do with race. And we're not just seeing a change in polls, but pressure for new policies, not only for reforms to police, but momentum for political positions that until now had rarely been discussed in the mainstream, like the defunding of the police. These changes are due to the incredible activism of the contemporary Black freedom struggle. We are today seeing the impact of the work of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been working to force attention to systemic racism. We are today seeing the impact of activists like Brian Stevenson, who've been fighting to force white Americans to reckon with America's history of racial violence. And we are today seeing the impact of countless Black and white activists who've demanded the removal of Confederate monuments, monuments which symbolically write a narrative of white superiority onto the landscape. It is due to their work that I think we are seeing a moment where more Americans are facing up to the existence and persistence of systemic racism and where there's more political momentum to actually do something about it. So it feels to me like this could be a historical moment. And I urge you all to be part of this history and not to just watch it from the sidelines. Get involved in whatever way you can, because this is everyone's fight for justice and for a truly democratic country. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Romano. Now we'll turn to Professor David Forrest.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks, Renee, Charles, and Matt for all that awesome history. Just as a prefatory comment, my comments here are going to focus much more on Minneapolis itself and much more proximate events. What happened in Minneapolis on the evening of May 25th was nothing new. For the last 30 years, officers like Derek Chauvin have acted as the foot soldiers in an elite-driven citywide effort to gentrify neighborhoods like Powderhorn Park, the historically diverse and low-income neighborhood where George Floyd was killed. A report published by the ACLU in 2015 showed that Minneapolis PD aggressively targets these neighborhoods, using low-level offenses as a pretense to detain Black youth, homeless people, and other allegedly suspect individuals. That is, individuals deemed threatening by developers, business owners, and middle-class residents. The killing of George Floyd was but an extreme instance of this more general pattern. But if what happened to Floyd was nothing new, what was somewhat new, for our time at least, was the response that followed. To my knowledge, the political uprising that has followed Floyd's death is the biggest that Minneapolis has seen since at least 1967. When young African Americans in North Minneapolis rebelled against the continued marginalization of their communities by demonstrating and by burning several properties. What's more, in contrast to those events of 1967, this uprising has drawn in a much larger and more diverse group of residents coming from communities across the city. And it has already provoked a substantial and unprecedented response from local officials. When moments like this happen, moments that mark or seem to mark a potential sea change in the politics of a city, I think it's important to step back and ask ourselves how they happened. In particular, I think it's important to ask how ordinary people, that is, people without significant amounts of wealth or status, helped to bring about these moments. Because contained within the answer to that question are some general lessons about how to effect substantial bottom-up change in American politics. In this particular case, if you look beyond the headlines, what you'll find is that since the Great Recession, a growing collective of organizers have really helped to broaden and radicalize progressive politics in the city of Minneapolis. These organizers work in a wide array of community and labor groups, such as Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, the Welfare Rights Committee, the Black Visions Collective, the Center of Workers United in Struggle, the Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition, AFSCME Local 3800, and several others. A number of the organizers working in these groups have been at it for decades. Others, especially of course the younger ones, have only entered the picture over the last 10 years. But together, in recent history, all of them have helped to dismantle popular acquiescence to the city's increasingly unequal and highly racialized political economy. They have developed a large and diverse community of activists who possess the know-how as well as the motivation to break rules and build majorities in support of egalitarian change. By the time of Floyd's death, this community of activists were already among the nation's most engaged participants in protests against police brutality and other inegalitarian and racialized practices. Practices like exclusionary zoning, eviction, wage theft, and the privatization of public education and public housing. These activists have also helped to elect and influence a new cohort of local officials who, through legislation, have further stoked popular opposition to the status quo. People like City Council members Steve Fletcher and Jeremiah Ellison, themselves former organizers, have led successful charges to eliminate single-family zoning, create inclusionary zoning, increase subsidies for affordable housing development, provide free legal assistance to renters, mandate paid sick leave, ban so-called warrior-style police training, and most recently, at least begin the process of wholly redesigning institutions of public safety. On their own, these localized reforms are not enough to fully reverse the tide of growing and racialized inequality or to save lives like George Floyd's. They do, however, further legitimate and encourage the aspirations for a better world witnessed in events like the George Floyd uprising. To be clear, I am not trying to suggest that the organizers I'm discussing are the sole reason for Minneapolis's recent political shifts. A series of escalating social crises have clearly played a major role as well. But these organizers have, in many ways, accelerated and channeled the popular displeasure unleashed by these various crises. How did they do it? Well, without more research and reporting, it's hard to say for certain. But based on what I know from past research and what I can observe from afar, I'd hypothesize the following. First, they have learned how to embrace and defend what I would call abolitionist demands, including, for example, demands for divestment from the police or for the expansion of public housing. These demands outline far-reaching but realistic paths towards abolishing mass incarceration, gentrification, and other interlocking systems of oppression suffusing American society. They raise people's expectations for a better world and push against ideologies that make these expectations seem ridiculous or unworkable. Second, many organizers in Minneapolis have coached themselves to deploy what I would call instructive rhetoric, which clearly describes and politicizes the systems targeted by abolitionist demands. This rhetoric works not by shaming, guilting, or manipulating regular people, but by educating them. It redresses public ignorance about social arrangements holding down large numbers of individuals and clarifies the moral justification for dismantling these arrangements. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they have embraced a commitment to grassroots mobilization, that is, to the recruitment and activation of a large majoritarian base rather than a small group of already committed or professional activists. Over the long haul, this approach to mobilization both makes their efforts more democratic and lays a clear path toward forging winnable conflicts around their demands. As the United States continues to lurch through the current moment of upheaval and uncertainty, the extent to which organizers adopt the aforementioned strategies will, I think, matter a great deal. And as we figure out how to respond to the George Floyd uprising in particular, I think it's worth listening more to ordinary people who have already done so much to remake politics in places like Minneapolis. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor Forrest. We'll now turn to Professor Jennifer Garcia.
Okay, thanks for having me. So I study race and ethnic politics and American political institutions, which generally means a bulk of my time is focused on trying to figure out how to dismantle systematic biases and racism within these institutions. So thinking about that thinking through that lens and thinking about what's happening today, I started thinking about do we see possibilities of real change here? And I think, like Professor Romano, I see some opportunities of hope and opportunities of change that could actually kind of materialize. And so I'm going to talk about anger and the role that anger plays in political mobilization and political participation in kind of a different way that it's been talked about thus far. So there's this new work in political science that shows that emotions, in particular anger, are incredibly important when it comes to participating in politics. However, how Black and white Americans participate, or how Black and white anger influences their participation varies. So we know, first of all, that white Democrats tend to report greater anger at the political process and political opposition than Black Americans. And in fact, Black Americans tend to report more resignation of why are we getting angry about this? This is something that has always happened, right? And what we end up seeing is that when we have greater levels of political anger among white Americans, this tends to translate into greater voter turnout. They tend to participate at greater levels. In contrast, under certain circumstances, we can see when Black anger begins to be evoked, it translates into greater political protests, greater political demonstrations, almost like what we are seeing right now. And the question is, how is it that this anger materializes into these different aspects? And what Davin Phoenix has showed is that under particular conditions, when we see police violence occurring, when we have Black political activists that are successful at encouraging African Americans to express their anger, not push it aside and not have to stay within the constraints of not being angry while Black, right? Being able to exert their anger and use it towards political purposes, we see Black participation actually increase a great amount. So the question really becomes, how do we then take this really strong and important momentum that we're seeing happening all across the country and translate it into sustained mobilization, and mobilization that actually has the input to the possibility to change these kinds of outcomes that we're seeing. And I think we have a few reasons for optimism. First is that among African Americans and whites lower from age 30 and younger, the anger gap is minimal. It's negligible. It's not even statistically significant. And what we're hoping this means, and what research is trying to figure out, is that the political empowerment that African Americans feel now as a result of having a Black president, as a result of seeing the conditions of the current political environment, they're able to then utilize this power to kind of create greater change. So because we see this anger gap negligible, this provides opportunities for hope. Another reason is, one thing that we have to worry about is political. So the role of anger can get, we can get pretty fatigued with it, right? So how do we translate anger into some sustained political mobilization? And because we continue to see kind of new technologies providing images of police brutality, et cetera, over the course of this whole time, this allows for kind of sustained political movement. We also see racial attacks continued by Trump et al., which continues to kind of fuel anger, and it continues to fuel different emotions. And we see successful Black activists trying to kind of catalyze this and use it to push forward a political momentum. As a result, I think that there are some good opportunities for actually placing sustained pressure on the institutions themselves and elected officials. So one of the ways that we need to do this is through the continuations of protests. And protests, even when there is violence, right, actually can make it a more salient issue and can provide greater pressure on elected officials and candidates. So being able to place extraordinary pressure on these officials, nominating your own candidates can prove to be highly successful. What we know in political science is protest matters. And actually, when we see destruction of buildings, when we see violence, either by police or either by protesters themselves, we actually see greater response by elected officials. And when we see the sustained effort, so even over this 10-day period of time, that's an extraordinary feat. And so when we see this sustained effort, we see elected officials feeling more and more pressure. And while it certainly takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, what we do know is that elected officials do respond to pressure, right? If they feel their electoral livelihood is based upon this, they will respond. And we've seen instances where they will respond in significant ways, like really changing their attitudes and their previously stated positions. So for a whole host of reasons, I think that there are a lot of, within all of this craziness, there's a lot of possibilities for true optimistic change. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor Garcia. And we'll end with Professor Justin Emeka.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. Thank my colleagues for, sharing what you all's perspective. It's been a really crazy week, how incredible and amazing how quickly our whole nation can get turned upside down. I teach in Africana studies and in the theater. My trade is in the arts. And so a lot of my work is in changing perspective, is transforming hearts through expression, and so a lot of this is I've just been kind of just trying to reflect and get a sense of like what I'm feeling in this time as an individual and what's going on in my community. What does my community need to hear in these times, to move forward, to move through these times and grow and become better. And, I think, first of all, a lot of us are feeling a lot of anger, pain, and frustration, and we got to find ways to let ourselves feel those emotions, and let us find ways to express those emotions and find ways to support each other as we feel these emotions. So, first and foremost, I encourage everyone out there, to take care of yourself and to take care of each other, and speaking to the Oberlin community in particular, to remind us that we're part of an extraordinary legacy here at Oberlin. Oberlin has been at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement, since the 19th century, and just want to remind us all of our role in that regard, that we are connected to a large legacy that we can draw from and reach and get inspiration to figure out how we move forward in these times, and I hope that Oberlin will continue to stay at the forefront of asking tough questions, of challenging each other, of loving each other fiercely, of creating new forms that help us reimagine society, and really there's like 5 specific things I want people to think about as we're moving forward. As I hear a lot of people are like, well, what can we do? Black and white students, people of all backgrounds are like, what do we do in this moment? How can we feel like we're contributing, and understand that when we're talking about systemic change, one, there's nothing that we're going to figure out in this forum or today that's going to make us feel like we're doing right. And that's not even the goal. The goal is not to make ourselves feel good and feel like we're being contributing, but to actually make systemic change, which unfortunately doesn't happen in one moment, but happens over the course of generations. And it happens by investing in certain principles and ideas. And here at Oberlin, the first principle that I want to encourage is for us to continue to study the history of Black people wherever you are, in whatever field you're in. If you're in the sciences, study the history of Black people in biology, study the history of Black people in the classics, study the history of Black people in philosophy. These are one ways to affirm the Black Lives Matter movement. Study the emergence of white supremacy in this history. Study how it emerged as a phenomenon and how it informs every aspect of our society, right? So before we do anything, we have to understand what it is we're dealing with, right? And there's no crash courses. You have to invest in this study. Then we want to look at second, we also want to look at policies, look and make sure that we have fair and equal and consistent policies that are in place, and demand that those policies are being promoted equally and enforced equally. And we have to not be afraid to dismantle when we run into policies that are inadequate. And sometimes we have to design new policies that help protect and promote equal rights and justice for all, right? Third, we have to also invest in the principle of changing hearts and minds, right? Providing education to help people learn and grow from new perspectives. We have to create new visions, hear new voices that help reveal the imaginations and the experiences of all our diverse people in the country. We have to create efforts that encourage dialogue, that encourage communications. Fourth, we have to also just support Black people, be articulate about your love of Black people, unapologetically articulate a love and support of Black people, and so that we understand that we can love everyone and achieve universality by being very specific and loving and supporting Black people. Embrace the diversity of all the different kinds of Black people. There's so many different kinds of Black people. Find a Black community and support them and uplift them and affirm them. Help get resources to Black communities, help provide services to Black organizations and Black communities. And then finally, find ways to impact your own life. Find ways to have conversations with aunts and uncles that you sometimes are too scared to have that conversation with because it gets too ugly too quick, right? Have that conversation with that friend who said something ignorant, but find a way to go into that conversation. Find a way to see are there things going on where we need to check the policy in our own life. Are we supporting the Black lives and the Black leaders in our own community and making sure that they have the tools to do what they need to do in order to reimagine society, So those are just a broad overview as I continue to work to stay inspired, because I also want to encourage Oberlin people to be upset, to feel your anger, to be sad, right? But then also remind that we don't have the luxury to just sit there and live in it. We are the people who are being trained to help reimagine our society. So take care of yourself, take care of each other as we, build a world for today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mecca. Okay, so we have a number of questions that are coming in, and I'm going to pose them to the panelists and encourage you to respond. I'm not going to ask each of you to respond to every question because then we'll never get through them all. So the first question. We've seen some pretty quick results as a result of the protests, including the starting to defund and dismantle police departments. What are some of your thoughts about alternative public safety systems and replacing police departments? What other changes do you expect to see in the coming months, and which ones do you hope to see in the coming months?
I'll start with that. I think fundamentally, each sort of municipality has to figure out what's best for them. You have some municipalities who already have certain type of policies in place that lower the risk of police killings. The example of Minneapolis, the city council deciding to sort of abolish the police department is, I think, really revolutionary, but there's going to be a lot of work in terms of determining what does public safety look like going forward. So I think it's got to be based upon what each city sort of determines its needs are. What I would like to see are cities rethinking how they are dealing with police unions. And I think that's sort of one factor, all of this, that has not been mentioned. And I'm a huge pro-labor, pro-union person. I come from a union family. But I think what we're seeing with sort of the police unions are not the ways we think about unions behaving in the public sphere. Right? I think about them as publicly funded militias who are really enthralled to fascist politics in many cases. So I think cities have to begin to think about what does that relationship look like? what will be the demands in the next contract session, and how can you develop ways for better oversight of the actions of the police, and also how can you think about ways to create a much more open and transparent and sort of cooperative police force, right? We have to start getting those bad apples out of the barrel, right? Because if we know one apple will contaminate an entire barrel, and it's easier to be a bad cop than it is to be a good cop.
I'll jump in and just add, I'd like to see, and I think in Minneapolis, hopefully we will see this, and I think this is going to be very politically heated. We've already begun to see a battle over the term defunding of the police. But from my understanding, what that means is actually reducing the scope of the things that the police are expected to respond to and building a social welfare state that we have not had in this country. So when you have someone suffering from mental illness, you shouldn't call a police officer to go and help them or often escalate the incident with them. You should call a trained social welfare person who knows how to deal with mental illness. There's many, many, many instances of things that the police right now are doing that they should not be doing, that we could have other ways to protect and to help people and promote public safety that have nothing to do with police and have to do with social welfare and really building a social welfare state. And the other thing that I think we have to do is we have to demilitarize our police. Like since 9/11, and really since before then, but particularly since 9/11, the Defense Department has been selling police departments or giving away to police departments military level equipment. And when we see police departments coming out with tanks and with this kind of stuff, it promotes a warrior mentality, it promotes a battlefield mentality, and it's incredibly dangerous to democracy and to everybody. And we have got to take steps as a country to demilitarize our police.
Jenny?
And one of the things I'm kind of looking for is, in the coming months, we're going to be voting. I mean, people are voting today in big primaries all across the country. And Georgia's voting today, and reports have it, right, that in Black communities, we see incredibly long lines and during pandemics. I mean, so, during pandemics in which they are disproportionately impacted. What I would love to see is an expansion of kind of the issues at hand here, right? So in order to really, to exert true influence, we have to have a system of electoral politics that actually treats everybody equal. And that's something that I would love to begin to see demands for, right? Like this redistricting system is crazy that we have. We have malapportionment with the Senate. We have electoral college stuff. But I mean, beyond that, we just have long lines in the United States of America. And they disproportionately impact different kinds of people. So I would love to see kind of building off of this momentum, kind of more like also fundamental calls for kind of electoral reform.
I mean, if I may quickly, I think what's important is that based upon this moment and how sort of the question of police violence against Black bodies is central to this, we have to begin to establish and articulate the ways in which this marbles out into the rest of society, right? How does this deal with questions of unemployment or questions of voting disparities or questions of segregated housing? I think there is a huge master way of thinking about all of this. And my fear is that sort of police violence will be the only lens by which people see these various problems. And if we can begin to articulate and connect the dots, right, and see how this is like this vast network, like veins running through like the civic body, and then that will help us to maintain the momentum and begin to address all of these other sort of issues.
So let me follow up with another question that I think connects to this about kind of what advice or what insight could you provide people who want to have those conversations, like you were saying, Professor Emeka, about changing hearts and minds? How do you get people who don't think that the police force is an oppressive structure to explain police brutality is not just a bad apple, but in fact something that's systemic? Like, how do you have that conversation? What kinds of things and what kinds of analysis can you offer us to share with others?
Mm-hmm. Well, these are real hard conversations to have. There's no exactly manual of how you do it, but in one level, going into the conversation, you trying to familiarize yourself with and study, again, the whatever issue that you're talking about, arm yourself with information as a way to begin. Now, going in and talking to people in terms of people who are resistant to ideas, exactly how you kind of how do you change someone's mind? That's $1 million question, because right now it's like, I think it was a Booker T. Washington who said, you can't legislate the heart, you can't write a law that's going to change the hearts of people. So how do we change the hearts and minds of people? And again, the short answer is I don't know. The way that I'm trying is by engaging in conversation as an artist, by trying to create works of art that help build empathy, and help people understand different perspectives and help people learn how to see themselves in places and in people they were trained to not see themselves in. Because, historically, white people and most all people around the world were trained to not see humanity in Black people, to not find their own humanity in Black people, So part of it is helping people embrace and love Black people, Black stories, Black experience, and see themselves in that. How exactly you do that? That's where we got to get creative and persistent and all of that. And when you figure it out, let me know.
So go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just say one thing, just to add on to all of that. I know that Professor Garcia and I actually had out a speaker a few years ago, and so she might remember this better than me, actually, because she's the one who did most of the organizing. But I think her name's, is it Melissa or Michelle Michelson, Jenny?
Melissa Michelson.
Melissa Michelson had she did all this research about exactly this question, right? And what she found was, at least one of the things, just a fast thing that helps is if you can relate the sort of position you're trying to help bring someone to, if you can relay it through some some source they trust. So like a person who they respect, who, has already kind of shifted their mind on this issue. If you can sort of articulate it through that person, it helps you to kind of establish some sort of common ground. Does that sound right?
And just real quick, also understanding that, knowing that the goal is not to change this one individual mind, right? The goal is to strengthen our ability to engage in discourse that sometimes will change minds and sometimes it won't. So even if you don't change this person's mind that you're talking to, you're sharpening your own skills and your own ability to engage in those kind of dialogues.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And then one other thing I wanted to add to this conversation was something that I think we sometimes, I know, just in doing research with activists, that people sometimes forget to do that actually is really helpful, is to remind people that, these things are there are a lot of ways in which the kinds of things we're talking about, like hyper-policing or the system of mass incarceration more generally, are harmful to people in ways they don't always understand or see. So, I mean, for example, this isn't about police killing, this is about, prison labor, but I would think of prison labor and paying people peanuts to do, work out in the community is actually bad for lots of people, right? That's putting a low floor on the labor market and pulling down, and making it harder for lots of people to demand higher wages for certain kinds of jobs. So, I mean, I think that this gets to the thing about being creative. There are ways in which we can build conversations, I think, that help people to see that actually the stuff that you may think isn't about you and is just about some other group of people actually is about you in some ways and actually can be harmful to you.
So here's a question specifically to Professor Rary and Professor Peterson that I think builds on this about how do you change a narrative? And it's specifically about kind of the ways that we can redirect attention away in the media, but also in kind of conversations, away from the obsession around property destruction back to the core issues that brought us to this moment to begin with, meaning white supremacy, unending violence against Black bodies carried out by the state. And that's another kind of question about how do you change that narrative? And so if the two of you could comment on that.
Well, I mean, certainly, and my understanding, I believe that part of the focus on the violence and sort of the property destruction is because, right, the media is still sort of a corporate sort of entity. And that's what drives ratings and that's what sort of drives advertising dollars. And I think it also, unfortunately, maintains the sort of the decades, centuries long idea of the dangerous Black violator, right? So this reinscribes certain sort of racist narratives. The ways that I've seen that narrative get changed is when sort of that lens gets broadened and you begin to see that protest. And, you know, when people are asking, why do you study Black people? This is kind of why. Because protest happens in the most amazing and creative ways, right? So now on the wall built in front of the White House, right, it's become sort of a monument. People are putting names and placards to memorialize those who have been killed by the police. You see these videos of activists who, in very sort of Abby Hoffman-like ways, are engaging in this absurdist sort of theater with the cops. There was one video, this young protester had a donut on a fish hook and was sort of dangling it in front of a line of policemen, right? So all that to say is that we have to widen the scope in terms of what constitutes protest. But we also have to realize that people sort of are finding ways to protest joyfully, right? They're excited, where they're invigorated by this desire to change the society and the conditions of their lives. And it's not going to manifest itself in just one way. So I think being able to point people to that, to broaden the media's lens on who they're focusing on, and also just showing that most of the protests are actually very well disciplined, very well organized, and very peaceful.
Yeah, I don't know, Charles, I think the original point that you made about the corporatization of media really hits the head. I mean, I've been seeing in the past week so many people on Instagram, on Facebook, on any other kind of social media platform, just sharing and sharing and sharing images that are meant to seem visceral, images that are meant to provoke really kind of reactionary and incendiary responses. And I think we have to try really strongly to resist that urge, not just in the present, but to be exceedingly careful with explicit images of anti-Black violence shared historically, right? And I think, Charles, just to build on the point that you were making, is one of the things that I was sort of trying to point to in my comments today was the manifold, the diverse, the very subtle ways that the interrogation of place and history and memory has happened through Black arts and through Black artistry. And it's not, there's so many sources, there's so many resources, there are so many people who've delved into this work. Look to the research that they're doing, look to the images that they're circulating, look to the histories that they're reconstructing, and share those instead. I think it's that simple.
Though I will say, well, this is a different point, but I know there's a huge discussion about sort of, in particular, the sharing of the videos of, say, George Floyd's murder, that type of thing, and what are the ethics of that? Right? To what degree do these become sort of a Black a macabre pornography, if you will? And I think a distinction has to be made, because my own personal view is that we have to be a witness to that, right? That we can't look away from that, right? But that's different from what you're talking about. But I think a distinction needs to be made in terms of what may be a necessary sort of witness versus something that's a bit more problematic and undermining.
Yeah, and I think there are so many artists I'm thinking of now, like Carrie Mae Weems is someone I look to very frequently, right? Who takes very explicit and very traumatizing images and reframes them in a way to allude to and interrogate the person who's doing the witnessing. So to put that kind of ethical onus back on us, the viewer, and to think really, really critically about the way that we share images, who we're sharing them with, and what kind of discourses we feel that we want to make in our sharing of those, right? Because I agree with you, we have to be witnesses to these events, we have to call them out, but we also have to do it in such a way that doesn't reproduce the power dynamics that created them in the first place, right?
Thank you. I want to return to a point that Professor Garcia made about voting, and to a question that was raised, if you or others could speak to the role of voting in this moment. Is voting simply participation in a fundamentally corrupt system? Is there hope for U.S. democracy, or has it been fundamentally poisoned by white supremacy?
Good questions. Okay. If anybody has a more articulate answer, please speak up. So I still think there's hope for American democracy, but saying that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to adhere to kind of the structure that we have right now, right? Part of having hope for American democracy is having this ability to change it and to make these alterations to it. And I mean, and at a certain point, that really does mean kind of fundamentally changing a lot of stuff. Like I'm writing a book right now on Congress and racial dynamics. And basically, I mean, Congress is producing these national laws and it's coming from an inherently racist position, right? So how do we then reconcile how much do we engage with that versus how much should we really focus on really trying to just kind of burn it all down and start from scratch, right? Finding that balance, I think, can be very tricky. And I don't know if I have exactly the right answer. So I'll tell you that I think it's important to vote, but when I say that, what I mean is I think it's important to use your vote to produce the change that you want. And using your vote can also mean not using your vote, if that makes sense, right? So, for instance, you know, would it be more helpful if just a whole bunch of people decided to band together and not vote in the next election? Would that send a clear message to whoever the two main political parties? Maybe, but then at a certain level, you're also then kind of giving away this voice that those people respond to. My personal view is I think it takes a combination of actions between voting and being active in voting and being active in protests and working to push outside of the system. So I think we can try to elect the people that best mirror our ideals and our goals, but just electing them is not going to do anything, right? We have to continue to push to demand that they participate and they behave in a particular kind of way, right? So to me, this would mean like when we elect someone, that means that I'm electing someone who I hope will be responsive to my demands. And if they're not, I'm going to try to elect someone else. And I'm going to demand, for instance, the elimination of the Electoral College, right? Or something like that. So I think they really go kind of in tandem, but I'm sure others here have really smart ideas on the subject too.
I'm not sure I'm smart, and not to be simply rhetorical, but I don't think American democracy has ever really existed. Is really the thing. So if we think we're moving or we're falling off of this ideal sort of mountaintop, we've never been to the mountaintop. But what I can say is there have been moments within the history of the United States where it has lurched forward in pretty dramatic ways. And usually those dramatic movements have happened when you've broken certain types of power bases that have been resistant to, I think, those movements. I mean, and Renee knows this better than I do, right? She's a great historian, right? But when you break the power of the plantocracy, right, and it opens up the door for the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, then that's a great step forward, right? When you have sort of the disruptions of the Great Depression and the recognition that government has to do more, then you get these great progressive moves forward. And even with FDR's New Deal programs, those are deeply problematic for Black people in terms of how they're excluded from those programs. Right? When you have the pressure of the civil rights movement, and as you said, the pressure on sort of politicians in Washington, you get the 64 sort of Civil Rights Act and the 65 sort of Voting Rights Act, which still are not perfect, right? So we're lurching like some beast toward Jerusalem, as it were, right, in terms of trying to accomplish this thing called American democracy. I agree with you, voting is important, right? Because I believe we have to use all the weapons in our arsenal. But I do also believe that what has to happen is we have to stop thinking about being citizens as a passive sort of position. And we do have to vote. And then the day after the voting, what are you doing? And the day after that, what are you doing? And it's a constant observation. If we want transparency, we have to look. Right. And I think that's necessary. So I'm not the most optimistic person about this, but I have been feeling a weird sort of optimism, seeing the events of the past sort of couple of weeks. But we have to keep it up. We can't stop. Right, we have to make these demands, and we have to get money out of politics. We have to rethink sort of access to the ballot. We have to make sort of, universal sort of voting the rule. So much things to do, but it's still. I want to believe it's still possible. Right, is what I'll end by saying.
And I'll just throw in that for me, voting is, you may not, the system is corrupt and problematic, and it may never achieve the change we want it to achieve. but we have seen certain people who hold power make other people's lives vulnerable in ways that they were not, more vulnerable than they were, right? Voting has consequences. The people who have power have consequences. Power can be used in terrible, terrible ways. And, I think to not vote when there are choices between someone who might make other people's lives more vulnerable and then, or cause other deaths, hasten the death of the planet. I think voting has consequences. It's not the only way to achieve change. But while we are seeking to achieve change in all kinds of ways, we better be cognizant of the consequences of what we do in our daily lives in terms of who is making the decisions, who is passing those laws, and who are the judges who are going to be making decisions about what even counts as illegal, right, in this country, legal or illegal. So I think everybody has a responsibility to vote personally, but that's me.
If I can add to that really quickly, I feel like so often when we talk about voting, we talk about big federal elections, we talk about big state elections. And really, so many of the decisions that are made in this country happen at the level of these local elections, your local city council, your local school board, what kind of textbooks are assigned to students in your district, that people really don't pay attention to those elections. The participation rates are very low. People don't often know about them. Get yourself educated on those particular local issues because they have such a reverberation when it goes up higher. And if you're not seeing the kind of people represented at your really local level, then you be one of those people. Be one of those voices and run for those positions if you're not seeing who should be there.
And local elections aren't always won by these gigantic numbers, right? So like every vote actually, you just need a few votes to come together to make some big changes there.
Yeah. I would say not just vote, but run. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know, but run as well.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be a special person, right? You have to be like a golden goose. Run.
Something I'll just add to this, since we're all kind of going around giving I think it's 4:00 now. So often when we talk about voting and movements, we talk about them as these sort of distinct strategies, but actually there's a sociologist, very famous social movement scholar, Frances Fox Piven, and her whole theory, right, is that the influence of these two things are fundamentally intertwined. That part of what makes movements powerful is that politicians become afraid that they're reshaping the electorate, right? And so to the extent that we can make the electorate more inclusive, more active, that actually increases the potential for movements to exercise power. So I actually think, yes, vote for all the reasons people said, and also vote because it's important for social movements.
So it is almost 4:10, and we still have 184 people who are part of this dialogue. So would you all be willing to stay for a few more minutes and answer more questions? All right.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So let's go to Gil Scott Heron. Someone said that they've been reminded of the revolution will not be televised and how we're all in a desperate need of fundamental transformation of entrenched ideas and deep-seated emotions and feelings. And this person would like to hear ideas about establishing broad community dialogue that shares resources, history, insights, and strategies. How might we do that? And what might that look like?
Can you read the last part of it one more time?
The student says, I would love to hear ideas of reestablishing broad community dialogue that shares resources, histories, insights, and strategies.
That's a very broad question. I'd like to start on broad ideas. Again, I think that we're in a time where we need to challenge ourselves to have these conversations. Just things I've been thinking about. This is just me, how important I think it is probably for Oberlin College, for departments in Oberlin College to discuss what Black Lives Matter means in the context of their work, safety and security, campus dining, res life, right? There's a moment right now where, again, the Black Lives Matter movement is looking at, in order to make systemic change, in order to change our minds and our hearts, we have to start to rethink and apply the principles of the importance of Black life in all different contexts, and be prepared to recognize when and where it's not being enacted. You know, it's very easy to be on the side of George Floyd. It's very easy to be on the side of Breonna Taylor, people who are sleeping, who are clearly, you know, violated, everything about it. Little less tricky even is getting into Mike Brown, for instance. People have different aspects, and well, maybe since he stole cigars, maybe he kind of deserved it a little bit. You know, people have less different opinions on even how important it is to support, you know, people who are closer to them. Our president, we have a Black woman president. How has that impacted the culture of our community? Have we supported her? Have we, I mean, just how does race matter in our localized little worlds, you know? And again, that's what those conversations look like to me, is different organizations just having conversations about how Black Lives Matter applies to their work and community.
Mm-hmm. I think along those lines, to stay with a focus on the local, there's a question about how to effectively bring other kinds of mobilization, for example, against police brutality, to smaller rural areas like Oberlin.
Mm-hmm.
There was a rally on Saturday, and at the rally, a call was made for Oberlin City Council to establish a civilian review commission and to engage in a full and public investigation of Oberlin PD's use of force policies, and then to adapt. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but the Movement for Black Lives has been circulating this 8-point platform of policies that can be implemented to reduce police killings. So a call has been made to city council, and there were city council people at the rally. So I know, at least in the context of Oberlin, that's been heard very clearly, and I do believe they're responding to that. And there are subsequent rallies that are being planned, and I know that call is going to continue to be maintained to city council. But I think this goes back to the point of vote. I believe in local politics. I think voting probably has the greatest amount of influence and power within local politics, and that one voice in a room at a commission meeting can transform that whole discourse. So I think in small towns, right, with enough pressure and enough sort of electoral engagement, I think these types of policies can be implemented. Not easily, because I think these police forces, whether they're in big towns or small towns, are going to be resistant to a greater level of oversight or a complete restructuring of how they function. But I think it's possible. And I think what happens at the local level can sort of spread to the state, and then eventually, hopefully, to some degree, have an influence at the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just throw in, I live in a different small town in Ohio, and one of the things that's been happening here, and that I think is just really important, is people putting out messages saying, who wants to talk about this? Let's get together and let's talk. Let's go set up a meeting with the police chief to say, what are your current practices and what are you doing? Let's figure it out, and let's ask how you can be better, like local citizens. I mean, these kinds of small groups are happening all over. And I would say in your local area, look for one. And if there isn't one, then just put out the message, right? That anybody can be active, right? This does not, we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for somebody else to say, let's ask the question about what are our police doing? Let's ask the question about what is the city council position? Let's ask the question about how we can make this place better. What are our problems and how do we make it better, right? Start the conversation in your town. Put out a note. Social media makes it easy, right? To find people who will be willing to have that conversation, to start that conversation. You might find people who, like, as Professor Mecca is talking about, are not going to be very happy with that conversation, and talk to them too, right? Talk to everybody, because that's the way we can begin to make change at the local level that then can, as Professor Peterson says, spread up, generate up to a higher national level too.
And for people who, like me, really, I mean, I haven't done a lot of community organizing, right? So I wouldn't know, I think that those are all great points, but I wouldn't know where to demand. I wouldn't know what to ask for. There are also kind of national or larger organizations that are putting out, so Charles Peterson's talking about the 8 Can't Wait campaign, right? And laying out the eight bullet points. So there are kind of broader resources that you can find that then you can maybe see how that could help your community or how it could apply to your community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think also, like, engaging resources, because if you don't know how to have the conversation, or lead the conversation, don't act like you do. Try and learn how to identify resources. There's people out here who are doing amazing work on our campus and beyond, who live and breathe this work. If you don't know, educate yourself and reach out and get, to resources that can help educate you or help you lead your department's or group's conversation on some of these issues.
Great. Here's a question. As a mixed race person, I'm often asked to speak for people of color in ways that I don't feel I can represent myself. How can we speak with each other without speaking for each other in these moments?
As a mixed race person. Can you read it one more time? I'm always big on hearing the question twice.
Absolutely. As a mixed race person, I'm often asked to speak for people of color in ways that I don't feel I can represent myself. So how do we speak with each other rather than speaking for each other?
Well, as a mixed race person myself, identity is very complex and fluid in America, for whoever you are, but particularly if you're multiracial, right? And trying to find out how you identify yourself is a journey, is a lifelong journey, and for me, it sounds as if at one level you're still searching for seeing where you fit in the world and understanding that as a multiracial person, oftentimes your identity is going to be fluid. The conversation of identity is not one conversation. There's many conversations that we're going to have, right? Sometimes we're going to have conversation about identity, American identity, and talk about gender. Sometimes we'll talk about identity and talk about sexuality. Sometimes we'll talk about location, and just because I have a conversation about being in one doesn't mean I'm in the next conversation. I'm over here, So as a multiracial person, a lot of it is learning how to fit into your multi positions in society, right? And you're not always speaking from just one place, but learning how to, well, in this conversation, I'm speaking about my experience in this way. In this conversation, I'm speaking about it in another way, coupled with just you figuring out and taking faith in defining yourself on your own terms, which is a lifelong journey.
So I'm going to pose one final question and invite all of the panelists perhaps to share their thoughts about this. So a student asks, is there one form of protest that strikes you as the most effective or promising during this particular moment than others?
Well, I'll say, real quickly, I think in these times, the most effective thing for you to is the one that you're good at. Because there's so much change that needs to happen. I don't think that there's anything less like, oh, we do this and we're good. This is the most important thing to change, There's so many things to change. I mean, I think right now we're really focusing on the justice system, which is a very important thing to try and key in and on trying to change. But part of the challenge is us really trying to figure out what are your skills and where do you fit in? Are you good at policy? Are you good at supporting people, changing people's hearts? Do you have money in your pockets? Can you fund? Can you raise money? Right? Whatever skills you have, and learning how to lend them to is really the best thing that you can do right now. And also not asking, what do I do? What do I do? Just like as you all become, assistants and go out into the professional world, one of the worst things that an assistant can say is, what should I do now? What should I do now? What should I do now? Right? Part of the challenge is you even learning how to assess, what's going on and where do I fit in? Where can I make a positive contribution? Right? That's part of the important of the work that's happening now.
Let's see how it gets any better than that.
Yeah. What Justin said. Yeah.
That's a beautiful way to end this conversation. I want to thank all of you so much for sharing your thoughts with everybody. And thank you for the over 200 people who joined us this afternoon. And even though we're physically distant, this is an example of how we all remain connected in these very difficult times, and we can sustain each other in really important and meaningful ways. So thank you all very, very much. Stay safe, and we hope to see everyone again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.